The frost on the windshield was still in sheet form when I left the station, the kind that comes off in one piece if you angle the scraper right. First light on the Kenai in March means gray more than it means bright, and the Forest Service road out to the eastern grid was a tunnel of black spruce with the sky barely lifting above it. I had the heater going and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and the truck's tires found the same ruts they always found, because I had driven this road 12 times since December and it didn't change. The grid runs north to south along the lake's eastern shore. 8 boreholes drilled into layered formations under the boreal interior, numbered 1 through 8 with a letter suffix I'd long since stopped needing to look up. I know the order the way you know the route to a job you've worked too long. Borehole 1, then 2, then on down, each one a stop of maybe 10 minutes if the access track is clear. I know what each one is supposed to give me before I pull the cap. Borehole 1C runs cold, close to 4 degrees Celsius year-round, fed by a shallow lens that never warms past what the lake itself gives it. 2C through 6C climb a little as you go south, the rock changing under them, but nothing that would surprise a first-year student with the survey map in his lap. I worked through them in order, stopped, killed the engine, walked the 20 yards to the wellhead, drew the sample, read the thermometer, logged the number in the field book, capped the tube, and got back in the truck. The ice on the access track ahead of me stayed unbroken the whole way down, which told me nothing had been out on this road since the last hard freeze. 6 boreholes, 6 numbers that matched what the rock had always given me. I didn't think about any of them again once I'd written them down. That's the job. You don't remember the readings that behave. Borehole 7C sits at the southern end of the grid, closest to where the formation starts running toward the lake's natural seep line. I parked, walked over, dropped the sample line, and drew the tube the same way I'd drawn 6 tubes already that morning. I uncapped the thermometer and read it standing there in the cold with my breath fogging in front of the display. 12 degrees Celsius above what that rock formation should have been giving me. I looked at it for a second too long. The number wasn't arguing with me, it was just sitting there being wrong. I checked the unit's calibration sticker. I tapped the casing once, which does nothing, but you do it anyway. Then I went back to the truck and pulled the backup thermometer out of my field kit, the one I carry in case the primary drops or floods, and I walked back to the wellhead and drew a second sample and checked that one too. Both units agreed. I stood there a minute with the boreal forest doing what it does at that hour, which is nothing, just spruce and snowpack and silence, and I thought about every reasonable explanation there is for a borehole running hot. A buried line, decomposing organics, some shift in the water table I hadn't logged. None of them got you to 12 degrees in a formation that had sat steady through 11 prior visits. I ran the sample through the spectrometer next, more out of habit than expectation. The instrument cycles through its library automatically, comparing the organic signature against every compound it's been loaded to recognize, and it usually gives you something: a partial match, a flag for review, even a clean read if you're lucky. This one ran the full cycle and gave me 2 words on the screen. No match. Not a degraded match. Not a compound it half recognized and couldn't commit to. A complete absence of correspondence with anything in its database, which is not a result I had seen the instrument produce in 3 months of use. I photographed the thermometer readout first, then the spectrometer screen, holding the camera steady against the cold so the numbers would come out legible. Then I sealed the sample in a glass specimen bottle, wrote the borehole ID and the timestamp on the label in block letters, and carried it back to the truck, where I set it down in the insulated cooler like it might still tell me something different if I gave it a minute. It didn't run that way. I drove the rest of the grid out of order in my head the whole way back, though there was nothing left to check. By the time I got back to the station, the light was going again, the gravel pad outside swallowed up in dark, 6 miles from the nearest other building. I sat down at the desk, pulled up the USGS Pacific Northwest Science Center portal, and filed a full anomaly report, the readings from both thermometers, the spectrometer log, the 2 photographs, a note that the backup unit had confirmed the primary, and that the compound scan had returned a complete non-match rather than a partial one. I wanted that distinction on the record. A degraded match is an instrument having trouble. A complete non-match is the instrument telling you it has never seen this before. The report went in at 7:14 p.m. I watched the confirmation screen load, then sat back and let the chair take my weight for the first time since before dawn. The cooler sat on the floor by the door where I'd left it, the sealed bottle inside it, the borehole ID facing up. Outside the window there was nothing to see. The gravel pad dark, the lake 6 miles west and invisible behind the trees. The whole station quiet around me the way it always was at that hour, except that I sat there a long time before I got up to do anything else. The phone rang before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. I picked it up halfway through the second ring, still looking at the instrument panel on the far wall. The array had been running diagnostics all night, a routine I'd set before going to bed, not because I expected to find anything, but because I wanted the confirmation in writing. "Casey, it's Abby." Her voice had that particular flatness that meant she was reading from notes. I'd heard it before, usually when she was relaying something from higher up the chain. "Morning," I said. "I wanted to touch base about your anomaly report from yesterday." She paused, and I heard papers shuffling. "It's been flagged internally as a probable sensor malfunction. We're pulling it from the public-facing data stream pending equipment review." I looked at the diagnostic panel. Every sensor was showing green. "When did it get flagged?" I asked. "This morning. Standard protocol for readings outside expected parameters." Another pause. "A replacement unit is being shipped. Should arrive Wednesday." "The sensors are fine," I said. "We'll know that once the replacement unit is installed and we can run a comparative analysis." Her tone hadn't changed. She was still reading. "In the meantime, suspend sampling from 7C until the new unit arrives." I didn't say anything for a moment. The diagnostic panel blinked, refreshing the status readout. Still green. "I can run the full self-diagnostic this morning," I said. "If there's a malfunction, it'll show up." "That's fine," Abby said. "But hold off on 7C until Wednesday." She ended the call before I could respond. I set the phone down and walked outside. The gravel crunched under my boots, and the morning was cold enough that I could see my breath. The instrument array was housed in a weatherproof cabinet mounted on a post 20 feet from the station door. I unlocked it and pulled up the diagnostic interface on the small mounted screen. The self-diagnostic took 40 minutes. I stood there the entire time, watching the progress bar inch forward, each subsystem reporting back in sequence. Temperature sensors, spectrometer optics, data logger, power supply, calibration offsets. Every line came back clean. When it finished, I took a photo of the results screen with my field camera and went back inside to call Abby. She answered on the first ring. "The array just passed a full diagnostic," I said. "Every unit. No faults." There was a pause, longer than the ones before. "Okay," she said. "I'll note that in the file. The replacement unit is still being shipped." "Abby." "Wednesday," she said, and hung up. I spent the rest of the day doing paperwork I didn't need to do. It stayed green. Wednesday was clear and cold. I saw the truck coming from a long way off, the white paint bright against the gray-brown landscape. It pulled up to the station just after noon, USGS markings on the door, and a man got out carrying a foam-lined case. He was maybe 50, wearing a canvas jacket and work pants. "Casey Thornton?" he asked. "That's me." He set the case down on the gravel and held out his hand. I shook it. "Got a replacement unit for you," he said, tapping the case with his boot. "Should only take a few minutes to swap it out." "Can I see your field ID?" I asked. He patted his jacket pockets, then pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Work order," he said, handing it to me. I unfolded it. It was a standard regional service request form, printed on USGS letterhead, dated 2 days earlier. His name was written at the bottom in ballpoint pen. No badge number, no field ID code. "Just the work order?" I asked. He nodded. "That's what they gave me." I looked at him for a moment, then folded the paper and handed it back. "Before you swap anything out," I said, "I need to run the standard calibration check, just to confirm we're replacing the right unit." "Sure," he said. "Step 1, I said. Primary calibration offset for borehole temperature sensors in layered aquifer formations. 0.5 degrees Celsius per 100 meters of depth," he said immediately. That was correct. It was also the only step printed in the service manual anyone could download from the regional website. "Step 2, I said. Secondary verification procedure for spectrometer baseline drift in cold weather field conditions." He paused. Not a short pause, a longer one. "Run a dual reference scan," he said finally. "Cross-check against the onboard library and the backup archive." That wasn't even close. The actual procedure involved a temperature-corrected blank sample and a manual wavelength calibration, and it was printed only in the regional onboarding manual that every field tech had to memorize before their first deployment. I looked at him, and he looked back at me, and neither of us said anything for a moment. "The array's reading correctly," I said. "I ran a full diagnostic 2 days ago. Every sensor passed. I don't think we need a replacement." He didn't argue. He just nodded, picked up the case, and carried it back to the truck. "I'll let them know," he said, and drove off. I watched the truck disappear down the access road, then went inside and looked at the cooler sitting on the floor beside my desk. The sample bottle was in the cooler where I'd left it, packed in foam insulation between 2 ice packs. I checked it Monday night right after filing the report, and it had been fine. Sealed, intact, the liquid inside still clear. Now the bottom of the bottle had a crack running across it, thin and clean, like someone had scored it with a glass cutter. The sample had evaporated down to maybe half its original volume, and the interior surface of the glass was covered in a fine white residue that looked like dried salt. I lifted the bottle out carefully and held it up to the light. The crack was sharp-edged, no spiderweb pattern, no impact point. Just a single fracture across the base. The cooler was cold. The ice packs were still frozen. I set the bottle down on the desk and stared at it. The heat hadn't come from outside. I looked at the clock. It was almost 6. The sun was already down, and the station lights made the windows into black mirrors. I put on my jacket and grabbed my field kit. The drive to Borehole 7C took 40 minutes in the dark. The access road was dirt and gravel, winding through low scrub and patches of black spruce, and my headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the trees. The lake was invisible to the west, just a presence in the dark. I parked at the pull-off and walked the last 100 yards on foot, following the flagging tape I'd tied to the trees the first time I'd run the circuit. The borehole itself was just a steel casing sticking up out of the ground, 6 inches of pipe with a locking cap. I unlocked it, pulled the cap, and lowered the sampling rig. The digital thermometer lit up as soon as the probe hit water, 19 degrees Celsius above ambient. I stared at the readout. 6 days ago it had been 12. Now it was 19. I pulled the sample and sealed it in a fresh bottle, then stood there with the thermometer still running, watching the numbers on the display. They didn't stop. 19.1, 19.2. The readout climbed, steady and slow, while I stood in the dark holding the bottle in my hand. I didn't go back to the station right away. I drove to the ranger station on Funny River Road instead, the Borough Road Department outpost that handled maintenance permits and snow removal schedules for the back roads. It was closed at that hour, but the blue mailbox outside was operational 24 hours. I sat in the truck with the engine running and wrote out everything on a page from my field notebook. Both temperature readings, the timestamps, the GPS coordinates for Borehole 7C, The spectrometer result, no match against full library. I kept it factual, no interpretation, just the numbers and what they meant. I folded the page into a plain envelope I kept in the glove box and addressed it to my own P.O. box at the Soldotna post office. No return address. I dropped it in the slot and heard it hit the bottom. The drive back to the station was quiet. The road was empty and the forest on either side was dark, just the sweep of my headlights catching the tree trunks as I passed. When I got back, I locked the door behind me, checked that the second sample bottle was still in the cooler. It was sealed and intact, and went to bed. I woke up to daylight coming through the window. The laptop was still on the desk where I'd left it, but the angle was different. Not much. Just enough that I noticed it when I sat up. I'd left it square to the edge of the desk, closed, the power cord wrapped around the base. Now it was open, tilted slightly to the left, the cord loose. I opened it and navigated to the folder where I'd stored the anomaly log, the photographs of the thermometer readouts, the spectrometer exports, the field notes I'd typed up after each sample run. The folder was empty, not moved to trash, not renamed, just gone. I checked the system logs. The files had been deleted at 3:47 in the morning. I'd been asleep. I called the main office and told them I was taking a personal day. No one asked why. Then I got back in the truck and drove south. The geological survey maps showed Borehole 7 Seas aquifer formation surfacing along the southern shoreline of Tustumena Lake, a series of natural seeps where the groundwater met the tree line. If the temperature readings were real, the seeps would show it. Thermal output didn't stay underground. I took Tustumena Lake Road south, and then the Forest Service road that ran along the lake's southern edge. The road was gravel, narrow, winding through dense spruce. I'd driven it twice before, early in my posting, just to see where it went. 3 miles in, 2 dark-colored pickup trucks were parked sideways across the road. 2 men in state emergency management vests stepped out and waved me down. I stopped and rolled the window down halfway. "Road's closed," the first man said. He was older, maybe 50, with a weathered face and no expression. "Hazmat protocol." "What kind of spill?" I asked. "Diesel fuel. Cleanup crews working the site now. Non-essential personnel need to turn around." I looked past him down the road. There were no other vehicles, no equipment, no cones or barriers. Just the 2 trucks and the 2 men. "When's it expected to reopen?" I asked. "Couldn't say. You'll need to check the state notification board." I pulled my phone out and opened the Alaska Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management page. The notification board loaded slowly, the signal weak out here. When it came through, there was nothing listed for Tustumena Lake. Nothing for the Kenai Peninsula at all. I looked back at the man. He was waiting. "All right," I said. I turned the truck around and drove back the way I'd come. By the time I got to Soldotna, it was past noon and I was hungry. I stopped at the Kaladi Brothers on the Sterling Highway and went inside. The coffee shop was half full, mostly locals, a few tourists passing through. I sat at the counter and ordered eggs and toast and coffee. The food came and I ate it without tasting much. A man sat down on the stool next to me. I didn't look up right away. He ordered a black coffee from the waitress and waited until she walked away before he spoke. "Name's Lucas Silva," he said. I set my fork down and looked at him. He was stocky, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair cut short and a scar through his left eyebrow. He didn't look at me when he spoke, just stared straight ahead at the wall behind the counter. "EPA surface water," he said, "or I was." I didn't say anything. I waited. "2 weeks ago, they pulled me off a core assessment," he said. "Kenai lowlands, lake bottom pools near Tustumena. Didn't say why. Just told me to hand over the samples and reassigned me." The waitress brought his coffee and he wrapped both hands around the cup. "I don't know what you're looking for," he said, "but if you're running into walls..." You're not the first. He slid a folded piece of paper across the counter toward me. I picked it up and opened it. A Homer address on Pioneer Avenue. A name written beneath it in neat block letters. Johnny McCarthy. That's all I've got for you, Lucas said. He finished his coffee in 3 long swallows, set down exact change next to the cup, and stood up. He didn't look back. He walked out and the door swung shut behind him. I sat there with the paper in my hand. The stool next to me was empty. The waitress came by and refilled my cup, and I stared at the name until the letters stopped meaning anything. Then I folded the paper and put it in my pocket and paid the check. The drive south from Soldotna to Homer took most of the evening. I should have been tired. I'd been up since before dawn running the borehole circuit. But my hands stayed locked on the wheel, and my mind wouldn't settle. I kept seeing that cracked glass bottle in the cooler, the white residue etched into the inside like something had tried to eat its way out. The Sterling Highway cut through miles of spruce forest and then opened up along the coast. The light was almost gone by the time I reached the turnoff for Homer, just the last gray edge of it hanging over Kachemak Bay. I drove through the main drag and then down toward the spit, following the address Lucas had written on that folded piece of paper. Pioneer Avenue was a residential block tucked up against the base of the spit, small houses and gravel driveways and wooden fences that needed paint. I found the number on a mailbox at the end of a narrow lot. Behind the main house was a converted single-car garage with a light on inside, visible through a row of high windows that ran along the top of the wall. I parked on the street and walked up the driveway. Before I could knock, the door opened. The man standing there was shorter than me, wiry, with thinning dark hair going gray at the temples and thick-lensed safety glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked at me for a moment, then stepped back and held the door open. "You're from the Tustamina grid," he said. It wasn't a question. "Casey Thornton," I said. "Lucas Silva gave me your address." "Johnny McCarthy." He nodded toward the interior of the garage. "I've been waiting for someone like you to show up for the better part of 2 months." I followed him inside. The garage had been turned into a working lab. A long bench along one wall with a microscope, a centrifuge, rows of glass beakers and specimen jars on metal shelving, a small fume hood in the corner. Everything was clean and organized in a way that reminded me of my own field station, that same careful arrangement of tools and instruments. Johnny moved to the bench and picked up a 3-ring binder, the kind with a clear plastic sleeve on the front. Inside the sleeve was a printed label that read, "Aquifer Samples, Kenai Peninsula, 2001-2003. He set it down in front of me and flipped it open. The pages were full of test results, water chemistry panels, temperature logs, spectrometry outputs, all of them printed on standard lab letterhead and organized by date. I recognized some of the sample codes from USGS borehole IDs. The earliest entry was dated August 2001. The most recent was from the previous week. "I ran these after a USGS colleague sent me samples," Johnny said. He was talking faster now, the way people do when they've been holding information too long. "He transferred out of state last year, stopped responding to contact. I kept running tests anyway." I looked up at him. "What did you find?" He pulled a printout from the back of the binder and laid it on top of the test results. It was an image from an electron microscope, black and white, magnified to the point where individual structures were visible at the cellular level. The organisms in the image didn't look like anything I'd seen before. They formed long chains, each link tessellated against the next in a pattern that repeated with perfect regularity. Hexagonal shapes, identical units. The whole structure locked together like something engineered rather than grown. It didn't look organic. It looked mechanical. "They're not bacteria," Johnny said. "They're not archaea. They don't match anything described in any database I've checked." I stared at the printout. The chains ran across the entire field of view, unbroken, each hexagonal unit identical to the one beside it. "What are they?" I asked. "The thing is," Johnny said, and his voice slowed down, the way it does when you're about to say the part that matters most. "They're thermogenic. They generate heat as a direct byproduct of their metabolic process. They break down silicate minerals in the surrounding rock matrix, and the breakdown produces thermal energy." He flipped to another page in the binder, a temperature log, readings taken at weekly intervals over the past 6 months. The numbers climbed steadily upward, 2 degrees Celsius per month, no variation in the rate. "They're warming the aquifer," Johnny said. "At this rate, within 14 months, the surface temperature of Tustumena Lake will begin to measurably rise." I looked at the numbers again. The progression was clean, no noise, no outliers, just a steady upward curve that didn't flatten and didn't slow. "How far have they spread?" I asked. Johnny pulled out a hand-drawn map of the Kenai Peninsula, the kind you sketch when you don't have time for anything formal. He'd marked the aquifer system in blue pencil, a long line running beneath the interior from Tustumena Lake north toward the Kenai River drainage. Red X's marked sample sites along the length of it. "My most recent calculation puts the colonization front at roughly 40 miles, he said. "The entire primary aquifer running beneath the peninsula interior, and it's moving north." I traced the red marks with my finger. They weren't clustered. They were scattered along the length of the aquifer, independent points separated by miles. "Where did they come from?" I asked. Johnny shook his head. "I don't know. But the pattern doesn't look like a single spreading source. It looks like multiple independent activations from deposits already present in the rock." I stood there looking at the map and the printout and the binder full of 18 months of data. The light overhead buzzed faintly. Outside, the wind was picking up off the bay. "There's someone you need to talk to," Johnny said. He pulled a blank test result page from the stack on his bench and flipped it over, writing an address on the back in neat block letters. "Her name is Abigail Nichols. She worked a water quality study on the peninsula in 1997. She was the first one to document thermal signatures like these in a funny river tributary." He handed me the page. Beneath the address, he'd written her name in a short note. "Removed from post. Data retracted. Living off-grid near Caribou Hills." "She's been out there since they pulled her off the study," Johnny said. "East of Soldotna. She'll have records they didn't take." I folded the page and put it in my jacket pocket. Johnny picked up the electron microscope printout and handed it to me. "Take this," he said. "You'll want to show her." I took the printout. The tessellated chains looked even stranger in my hand, that perfect repeating structure that didn't belong to anything I knew. Johnny walked me to the door. The garage light spilled out onto the gravel driveway and then stopped, swallowed by the dark. The Homer spit was quiet, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the distant hum of a truck on the highway. I stood there for a moment with the printout in my hand and the address written on the back of the test result page. Then I walked to my truck and drove north. The gravel road climbed into the Caribou Hills through thick stands of spruce that pressed close on both sides. I followed the directions Johnny had written on the back of the test result page, the handwriting cramped and angular. The road narrowed as it rose, and the trees thinned just enough to let patches of sky through. The house sat back from the road, logs stacked tight under a low-pitched roof. A wood pile ran the length of the front wall, split rounds stacked all the way to the eaves. A hand-painted address marker stood at the edge of the drive, the numbers done in careful white strokes on weathered plywood. I parked and walked to the door. Before I could knock, it opened. The woman standing there was lean and upright, her white hair cut short, her gray eyes steady on my face. She looked at me for a long moment, not suspicious, just measuring. "You're from Tustumena," she said. "Borehole 7C. She nodded once. "I've been waiting for this conversation since 1997. Not with you, with whoever eventually found those readings. She stepped back and held the door open. I went in. The house was small and warm, a wood stove crackling in the corner. The kitchen table was covered with a laminated map, its edges worn smooth. She gestured to a chair and I sat. She walked to a shelf above the counter and took down a handheld recorder, the kind with a cassette tape inside. "I made this the day they escorted me out," she said. She set the recorder on the table between us and pressed play. Her own voice came through the small speaker, flat and precise, reading numbers aloud. Sample temperatures, GPS coordinates, timestamps. The voice on the tape never paused, never wavered, just moved from one reading to the next in the same steady rhythm. The tape stopped. She pressed the button and the wheels clicked to a halt. "They confiscated everything else," she said. "Every sample, every log. That recording was in my jacket pocket when they walked me out." She sat down across from me and pulled the laminated map closer. It showed the Kenai Cook Inlet Basin, the coastline running north to south, the aquifer systems marked in blue. She took a pen from the table and tapped 3 points along the western shore. "Susitna River Delta," she said. "Beluga Coal Field, Redoubt Bay Drainage." She tapped each one as she named it. "Anomaly filings between 1991 and 2001, all retracted." I looked at the marks. They were scattered across 100 miles of coastline, no pattern I could see except that they were all near the water. "The organisms are in all of them," she said. "The same colonial structure, the same thermal output, and the activations are independent. They're not spreading from a single source point. They're waking up from deposits already in the rock." I stared at the map. The 3 points she'd marked were just the ones with filings. There was no way to know how many more deposits were out there, dormant and waiting. "How old are the deposits?" I asked. "Cretaceous silicate formations," she said. "Roughly 70 million years." 70 million years. "What triggered them?" I asked. "Cook Inlet runoff," she said. "Oil and gas operations. The chemistry shifted in the late 80s. The pH changed, the mineral balance changed. It matched the activation threshold for dormancy." She said it the way someone reads a result off an instrument. No anger, no bitterness. "The runoff is the key," she said. "It unlocks the deposits." I thought about the 7C readings, the temperature climbing every time I went back. Not a spill, not a leak. Something waking up. "There's a geologist named River Taylor," she said. "Retired USGS. He lives near Anchor Point. He has the deep core data that proves the Cretaceous origin. He's been trying to get a letter in front of a senior director for over a year." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "He keeps a waterproof backup case under a loose board in his workshop floor. Anything he doesn't want in the main house." I wrote the name down. She watched me, her gray eyes steady. "He's the last person who still has documentation," she said. "After him, there's no one left." I stood. She walked me to the door, and I stepped out onto the gravel drive. The woodpile sat silent against the wall, the afternoon light slanting through the trees. I got in the truck and drove south. The Sterling Highway ran straight and flat through the lowlands, then curved west toward the coast. By the time I reached Anchor Point, the light was starting to go thin, the sky pale and cold above the inlet. Taylor's house sat on a gravel lot above the beach bluff, a single-story frame with a detached workshop set back from the main building. I parked in the driveway and walked to the front door. It was standing open. I stopped at the threshold and looked inside. The main room was empty. No furniture, no boxes. The kitchen table was bare except for a single coffee cup sitting near the edge. I stepped in and touched the side of the cup. It was still warm. I walked through the house. Every room was the same, stripped clean. No files, no binders, no hard drives. The closets were open and empty. The shelves were bare. I went back outside and crossed the gravel lot to the workshop. The door was unlocked. Inside, the benches were clear, the walls stripped of whatever had hung there. The floor was plywood, laid in sections, the seams visible where the boards met. I walked the length of the room, watching the floor. Near the back corner, one section sat slightly higher than the others, the edge raised just enough to catch the light. I crouched and worked my fingers under the board. It lifted easily. Underneath was a sealed waterproof pelican case, black and heavy, the latches still locked. I pulled it out and set it on the bench. The latches opened with a snap, and inside was a portable hard drive wrapped in a static bag. I took the drive out and held it in my hand. It was small and light, the kind of thing you could carry in a jacket pocket. I put the drive back in the case, closed the latches, and walked out of the workshop. The front door of the house was still standing open, the coffee cup still on the table. The beach bluff dropped away below the lot, the inlet stretching gray and flat toward the far shore. I stood there with the case under my arm, the wind coming up cold off the water, and looked back at the empty house one more time. Then I walked to the truck and drove north. I pulled over at a wide gravel turnout north of Ninilchik, the highway empty in both directions. The truck ticked in the cold as I opened the laptop on the passenger seat and connected Taylor's hard drive. One folder, his name and the year 2002. I opened it. The first files were photographs, geological core samples, deep formations, the kind of layered rock you pull from a mile down. I clicked through them slowly, watching the strata change color and composition with depth. Sandstone, shale, the compressed sediment of an ocean floor that hadn't existed in 70 million years. And there, in a formation labeled Late Cretaceous, the organism. I zoomed in. The tessellated chains were perfectly preserved in the rock, each hexagonal link identical to the living specimens in Johnny's electron microscope images. Dormant. Waiting. I sat back and stared out at the inlet. The water was flat and gray, stretching away toward the far mountains. 70 million years. The organism had been there before the ice, before the uplift, before any of this was a peninsula at all. I opened the next file. A letter, dated October 2002, addressed to a senior director at the USGS Alaska Science Center. I read it twice. Taylor had laid it out clearly. The groundwater acidification from Cook Inlet industrial runoff matched the chemical trigger profile for colony activation across all known deposit sites. The deposits weren't new. The runoff was unlocking something already there, something that had been locked in the rock since the Cretaceous. At the top of the letter was a response stamp. Red ink, official. It read, Referred, Federal Review. Nothing else. No follow-up. No correspondence. At the bottom, in Taylor's handwriting, a single line. The organism was here before us. We woke it up. I closed the laptop and sat in the cold cab with the engine off. The wind rocked the truck gently. Taylor had known they were coming. He'd left the drive where someone could find it, and then he'd walked out before they arrived. I opened the laptop again and copied the entire folder into a draft email. Not sent, just saved. Then I disconnected the drive, wrapped it in the static bag, and put it in the glove box. The highway was still empty when I pulled back onto the asphalt and headed north. The dark blue sedan came up fast behind me just past Soldatna. No lights, no siren. It pulled alongside, and a man in the passenger seat gestured for me to pull over. I did. Two men got out, plain clothes, no badges visible. One opened my door without asking and said, "Phone and laptop." I handed them over. "Follow us," he said, and walked back to the sedan. The office was in a strip mall on the Kenai Spur Highway, tucked between a tax service and a vacant storefront with soap still on the windows. No signage. The sedan pulled into a spot near the side entrance and I parked beside it. Inside was a single room with folding tables, metal chairs, and a satellite image of the Kenai Peninsula mounted on the far wall. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The two men who'd pulled me over stayed by the door. A third man sat at one of the tables. He stood when I walked in.
"Mr. Thornton," he said, "my name is Miguel Murray."
He gestured to the chair across from him. I sat. Murray slid a sheet of paper across the table. A non-disclosure agreement, dense with legal text. I didn't touch it.
"Your anomaly report," Murray said, "does not exist in the USGS system. Your employment with USGS is under administrative review. The glass sample you retained from borehole 7C constitutes a biohazard protocol violation."
I looked at him. He was tall and lean, with short gray hair and pale blue eyes that didn't move off my face. "Physical copies of Taylor's research are already outside this room," I said. "So are Johnny McCarthy's test results." It was partly true. I'd mailed Taylor's documents to my post office box that morning. Johnny's binder was still in his lab. Murray looked at me for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and said,
"Stop worrying about the lake. Start worrying about the river."
He slid a second sheet across the table. A satellite image, false color thermal mapping. The Kenai River ran through the center in shades of blue and green, except for one section about 40 miles north of Tustamina Lake, where a bright red plume spread through the gravel bed like spilled paint.
"This was taken 6 days ago,"
Murray said.
"The organism is no longer confined to the aquifer."
I stared at the image. The plume was large, maybe half a mile across, concentrated in the gravel substrate where the river widened into a braided channel.
"It's in open freshwater,"
Murray said,
"and its thermal output has increased by a factor of 4 since the transition."
I looked up.
"Deep rock," Murray said, "limits access. The organism can only metabolize the minerals in direct contact with the colony. Open water gives it the entire substrate, every stone, every grain of sand. The river delivers more material than it can process."
He pulled a folder from the table and opened it. Inside were graphs, projections, columns of numbers I didn't have time to read.
"The program tracking this is called VANE," Murray said. "We've been monitoring the organism since Abigail Nichols's 1997 report. The containment strategy for the past decade was built on one assumption. The organism couldn't survive the chemical and pressure transition from deep silicate rock to open fresh water."
6 days ago, I said.
6 days ago, that assumption failed."
He slid another document across the table. A projection chart. Temperature over time. The line climbed steadily for 30 days and then flattened at a level marked in red.
"If the surface water colony is not disrupted within 30 days, Murray said, the Kenai River's temperature will rise enough to kill its Chinook salmon population within one spawning season. The collapse cascades from there. Bears, eagles, marine mammals, the entire coastal ecology downstream."
I looked at the chart and then at the thermal image. The red plume sat in the middle of prime spawning habitat. Murray pulled out a third map. The Cook Inlet Basin, marked with small red dots, 18 of them scattered across the western Alaska coastline from the Susitna River Delta down to Redoubt Bay.
18 additional known deposit sites, Murray said, all currently dormant. The chemical trigger, the industrial runoff, is still present in the watershed every day. More deposits are activating on a timeline we can't fully predict.
"Then stop the runoff," I said. Murray looked at me.
"The EPA runoff abatement program required to stop the activations is classified as a national security matter. Implementing it publicly would require disclosing that Cook Inlet industrial permitting was allowed to continue for 30 years after the activation risk was first identified internally."
I sat back in the chair. The fluorescent lights hummed. One of the men by the door shifted his weight.
"I'm offering you a role on the Vane response team," Murray said. field hydrologist for the Kenai River operation. You know the Tustamina aquifer grid better than anyone currently on staff.
I looked at the thermal image again, the red plume in the gravel. 30 days. What's the alternative? I asked.
You go home,
Murray said,
and we proceed without you.
I signed the agreement. The forward station was a cluster of portable units on a gravel bar off Bing's Landing Road, set back from the river in a stand of cottonwoods. Generators hummed behind the main unit. The air smelled like diesel and cold water. Murray brought me inside. The interior was warm, lit by overhead strips, with a long table covered in maps and equipment manifests. A man stood at the far end, marking something on a laminated chart.
Paul Rush,
Murray said.
lead scientist. Paul, this is Casey Thornton.
Paul looked up. He was shorter than me, round-faced with thinning blonde hair and rimless glasses. He nodded once and went back to the chart.
Mr. Thornton will be handling field hydrology,
Murray said. Paul set down his marker.
Good. We're on a tight schedule.
He gestured to the map on the table. The Kenai River, marked in sections. One section was circled in red, the same area from the satellite image.
The intervention plan is chemical,
Paul said.
A silicate binding agent delivered into the substrate via injection lances driven into the gravel bed. The agent calcifies the colony and kills it within 48 hours of application.
He pulled a binder from the table and flipped it open. Chemical formulations, dosage calculations, delivery specifications.
The lances go in at 30-meter intervals across the affected zone,
Paul said.
We inject, we wait, and we monitor thermal output. If it drops to ambient within 48 hours, the colony is dead.
I looked at the map. The circled section covered nearly a mile of river. What about the gravel? I asked. Paul looked at me. The binding agent, I said. What does it do to the substrate?
It calcifies the matrix,
Paul said.
Permanently. That's how it works.
I stared at the map. The circled section was prime spawning habitat. Chinook salmon used gravel beds like that to lay their eggs, to bury them where the water could flow through and keep them oxygenated. If the gravel calcified, it became concrete. No flow, no oxygen, no spawning. You'll destroy the beds, I said. Paul closed the binder.
It's an acceptable trade. If the colony reaches Cook Inlet proper, saltwater access makes containment impossible.
Murray stood by the door, watching. Paul picked up his marker again.
Delivery begins in 12 hours. I'll need substrate composition data from the affected zone before we start. That's your job.
I looked at the map and then at Paul. He was already back to his chart, marking injection points with small red dots. The Kenai River ran just outside, audible through the thin walls of the portable unit. I left the forward station and sat in my truck with the formulation document on my lap. The binding agent worked by calcifying the silicate matrix around the organism, locking it in place, suffocating its metabolic process. That part was clear. What the document didn't say outright was that the same calcification would turn the gravel beds into concrete. The spawning habitat would be gone. Not damaged. Gone. I read the section on substrate impact twice. The language was careful. Permanent structural alteration, irreversible bonding at the mineral level, but it landed the same way every time. The Chinook used these beds. They needed loose gravel to dig their redds, to lay their eggs, to give the next generation a place to survive. The binding agent would seal that shut. I drove back to the station and found Paul in the same portable unit, marking injection points on a laminated map.
The formulation document,
I said.
The spawning beds.
Paul looked up.
What about them? The binding agent calcifies the gravel matrix, permanently.
He set the marker down.
It does. That's the habitat,
I said.
The Chinook spawn there. I know.
I waited for him to say more. He didn't.
So we're trading the beds,
I said. Paul picked up the marker again.
It's an acceptable trade against the risk of the colony reaching Cook Inlet. Open saltwater access makes containment impossible. We do not get a second attempt. How certain are you that the binding agent will hold the colony before it migrates further?
He looked at me.
Certain enough.
I stood there another moment, then left. The delivery schedule was taped to the wall in the operations trailer. The first injection lance was scheduled for 0900 the next morning. That gave me 12 hours. I got in the truck and drove south. The road to Homer was empty and dark. I drove with the windows cracked, the cold air keeping me sharp. My headlights caught the edge of the forest on both sides, the trees packed tight and leaning in. Every few miles a road sign appeared and disappeared. I thought about the gravel beds under the Kenai River. I thought about Paul's certainty. I thought about acceptable trades. By the time I pulled onto Pioneer Avenue, it was after midnight. Johnny's garage had a light on. I parked and knocked. He opened the door before I finished.
You're back. I need a different formulation,
I said. He stepped aside and I walked in. The lab smelled like acetone and something metallic. A row of sample vials sat on the bench under a lamp, each one labeled in Johnny's cramped handwriting. I told him about the binding agent. I told him about the gravel. He listened and didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said,
The thing is, you need to disrupt the metabolism without locking the substrate. Yes.
He pulled a stool over and sat down.
Targeted pH acidification. You flood the zone with low pH water. It alters the mineral surface chemistry. The organism can't break down the silicate anymore. It dies. Without calcifying the gravel, without calcifying anything, the acid dissipates downstream. The substrate stays loose.
I looked at the sample vials.
Can you test it? I can test it in here, he said. Whether it works at scale in a moving river, that I can't tell you yet.
I called Abigail from the phone on Johnny's workbench. She picked up on the third ring and said she'd be there in an hour. She arrived with a thermos of coffee and a binder of her own field notes from 1997. We sat at Johnny's bench and worked through the formulation. The organism's silicate breakdown process depended on a narrow pH range. Johnny's data showed it couldn't function below 4.2. Abigail's notes confirmed it. We had a target. Johnny mixed the acidified solution in a glass beaker and added it to one of his live samples. We watched the temperature probe. The reading started at 14 degrees above ambient and began to drop within the first hour. By 3 in the morning, it was at 8 degrees above ambient. By 5, it was at 2. By 6:30, it reached ambient and stayed there. Johnny ran a viability test on the sample. The organisms were dead. Abigail leaned back and rubbed her eyes.
It works in the lab. It works in the lab,
Johnny said. I looked at the sample vial. The organisms inside were motionless, their tessellated chains broken apart and scattered.
I need to get back,
I said. I drove north as the sun came up, the light spreading across the frozen fields on both sides of the highway. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my chest felt tight. The lab results were clear. The open water question wasn't. I reached the forward station just after 7 and found Murray in the operations trailer. Paul was there too, reviewing the injection schedule with a field tech. I set Johnny's printout on the table.
Overnight results. pH acidification. The organism is dead in 6 hours. The substrate stays intact.
Paul picked up the printout and read it. He set it down.
There is no open water validation data. The 30-day window does not allow for a failed first attempt. We proceed on schedule.
I looked at Murray.
I'm invoking the hold.
Paul turned.
What? The vein emergency protocol,
I said.
Mandatory 72-hour hold on irreversible field actions. You told me about it yourself.
Murray looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded.
The hold is granted. 72 hours.
Paul's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He left the trailer without another word. The next 3 days were the longest I'd lived through in a year. Johnny drove up from Homer with his equipment, and we set up on the gravel bar nearest the treatment zone. A vain field chemist named Karen joined us with a portable thermal array and a box of probes. We mapped the affected substrate, marked the injection points, and ran the pH solution through a delivery system Karen had jury-rigged from irrigation hose and a hand pump. The first probes went in at noon on the first day. The thermal readings in the treatment zone were 16 degrees above ambient and climbing. We flooded the zone with acidified water and waited. By evening, the readings had dropped to 12 degrees above ambient. By the next morning, they were at 8. Karen checked the gravel substrate with a core sampler. The matrix was intact, the individual stones loose and undamaged. On the second night, I slept in the truck with the windows cracked and woke every few hours to check the data logger Karen had left running. The numbers kept dropping. By the third morning, the readings were at 2 degrees above ambient. By noon, they were at 1. By mid-afternoon, they reached ambient and held. Karen pulled a final core sample from the treatment zone and showed me the gravel. It was clean, loose, viable. Johnny stood next to me and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I walked down to the river's edge and watched Karen record the final reading. The current moved over the gravel beds, steady and cold and undamaged. The spawning habitat was still there. The Kenai River kept running. I filed the complete report 3 days after the thermal readings normalized. Every piece of it, the March 9th anomaly at Borehole 7C, the cracked sample bottle, the roadblock at Tustumena, the Homer lab results, Taylor's core data from the Pelican case, Abigail's 1997 recordings, the overnight pH acidification trial, the Kenai River substrate treatment. I laid it out chronologically, clean and thorough, the way I'd been trained to document fieldwork. I attached the test results, the photographs, the coordinates. I wrote it like someone would read it and act on it. 2 weeks later, I called Murray's office to confirm receipt. The woman who answered the phone told me my file had been forwarded to federal review. She did not know when it would be returned. She thanked me for my service. That was the last time anyone from Vane acknowledged the report existed. My contract renewal notice was supposed to arrive in April. It didn't. I called Abby's office in early May and got her voicemail twice. The third time, someone else answered and told me Ms. Harper was in meetings and would return my call. She didn't. The letter came a week later on Pacific Northwest Science Center letterhead. Budget consolidation. Contract non-renewal effective June 1st. A phone number for the administrative office if I had questions about final payroll. I didn't call the number. I packed up the monitoring station on a Tuesday morning in late May, boxed the instruments, labeled the containers, and stacked them in the back of my truck. The prefab unit sat empty on the gravel pad with the door propped open. I left the key on the desk inside. The drive back to Soldotna was quiet. I didn't put the radio on. The Kenai Peninsula Borough had an opening for a water quality consultant. Municipal systems mostly. Testing wells and treatment plants for small communities along the Sterling Highway corridor. I interviewed on a Thursday and started the following Monday. The work was straightforward. Drive to a site, pull samples, log the data, file the reports. The borough office was a low cinder block building off the Kenai Spur Highway with fluorescent lights and a kitchenette that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee. My desk was in a back room with 2 other consultants who worked different schedules. Most days I had the room to myself. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in Soldotna, 2nd floor, facing the highway. The sound of traffic became background noise within a week. Johnny called me in mid-July. His voice was tight in a way I hadn't heard before. "They audited me," he said. I was at my desk in the borough office, midway through a well sample report for Ninilchik. I set my pen down. "When?" "Last week. EPA Regional Office. Chain of custody documentation for samples I ran 2 years ago." He paused. I heard him exhale. They suspended my license. 6 months.
On what grounds?
Technical filing violation. I had the samples logged, I had the results documented, I just didn't have the original transfer forms signed by the contractor who sent them.
His voice went quieter.
The contractor who transferred out of state and stopped answering emails.
I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say.
I'm disputing it,
Johnny said.
I've got a hearing scheduled for September.
Okay.
I'm going to lose.
He hung up before I could answer. I drove out to the Caribou Hills on a gray morning in August. I told myself I was just passing through, that I had a site visit near Funny River and the detour wasn't far. I knew that wasn't true. The gravel road into the hills was the same as it had been in March, narrow, winding, the trees close on both sides. The hand-painted address marker was still nailed to the post at the turnoff. The house sat back from the road the way I remembered it. The woodpile was stacked to the eaves, the same cords of split spruce I'd seen the first time, untouched. The windows were dark. The front door was locked. I walked around to the back. The workshop door was locked too. I looked through the window and saw an empty table, a few tools hanging on the wall. Nothing else. I stood there for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. No smoke from the chimney. No tire tracks in the gravel. No sign that anyone had been there since the river ran cold. I didn't try the door again. I got back in my truck and drove to Soldotna. The first email arrived in September. No subject line, no header, no signature. Just a short block of text with 3 lines of data. Coordinates, dates, thermal gradient readings. Each line ended with the word stable. I didn't recognize the sender address. I replied asking who I was speaking to. The response came 2 days later. Just the numbers, nothing else. I printed the email and filed it in a folder I kept in my desk at the apartment. I didn't know what else to do with it. The second email arrived in November. Same format, same style. 2 deposit sites this time, both marked stable. I printed it and added it to the folder. By the end of the year, I had 4 emails. The pattern was consistent. Every few months, no predictable interval, always the same sparse layout. Numbers only, no agency header, no context. I checked the federal budget documents online in early 2004. The Cook Inlet Industrial Runoff Abatement Program had been reclassified from active to deferred. No public notice, no explanation. Just a line item change buried in a spreadsheet that took me 3 hours to find. In the 2 years following the Kenai River incident, 3 additional deposit sites in the Cook Inlet Basin registered activation signatures. I knew because the emails kept coming. Each site appeared in one update with rising thermal readings, then in the next update with the word stable appended. Johnny's hearing went the way he said it would. His license suspension was upheld. He called me in October to tell me, his voice flat and exhausted, and then he said he was closing the lab. He didn't say where he was going. I didn't ask. I drove out to the Caribou Hills one more time in late autumn. The house was still locked. The woodpile was still untouched. I didn't get out of the truck. The work at the burrow was steady. I tested wells in Castleoff, treatment plants in Clam Gulch, distribution lines in Anchor Point. I filed clean reports and attended the occasional staff meeting. My supervisor was pleasant and left me alone. The job paid enough to cover rent and groceries and gas. I didn't talk about the Kenai River. No one asked. The emails kept arriving, every few months, sometimes longer. The format never changed. I printed each one and added it to the folder, which eventually moved from my desk to a file box under my bed. The most recent one came last week. 3 deposit sites, each marked stable. I read it twice, checking the coordinates against the older emails to see if any were repeat listings. They weren't. 3 new sites, all activating, all being monitored, all waiting. I set the email down on my desk. Outside, the Sterling Highway carried its usual evening traffic, trucks heading south toward Homer,
cars heading north toward Anchorage. Somewhere out there, the watershed was still carrying the same water it always had, moving through the aquifers and into the rivers and out to the coast, carrying whatever the runoff had left in it. The runoff was still there. The deposits were still waking up. I folded the printout and added it to the box under my bed. Then I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the highway, the sound of it steady and unbroken, the way water sounds when it just keeps moving.